Good morning, everyone, and welcome to week one of our 4-week adult formation series entitled The Blessed Company of All Faithful People. I am Father Drew Harmon, your Senior Associate Rector here at St. James, and it is truly a joy to be here with you at St. James in this wonderful community of faith. And it's a deep privilege to get to put together many of these adult formation offerings. Adult formation is an abiding passion of mine and informs much of what I do and how I operate as a parish priest. I see my calling as priest as one of invitation, of inviting people into the depth and richness and mysteries of the Christian tradition, of asking questions of that tradition, and seeing how the Spirit is at work in our hearts and in our minds. And this is precisely what we get to do during this series as we walk with the faithful through topics and questions central to our common faith. And so with that, let me share my screen and we will get started with today's presentation. So my aim for each of these 4 gatherings, even through this Zoom medium, is to think through particular topics with the forebears in the faith in full view. These forebears in the faith form what the Rite One post-communion prayer calls the blessed company of all faithful people. So over the course of these next 4 weeks, we will work our way through aspects of the interpretation of Scripture, prayer, theology, and ethics, or moral theology. But first, a disclaimer. None of these sessions will be exhaustive on their particular subject. If at the end of each session we've boiled down prayer or theology or ethics to one digestible sentence, then I'm afraid we might have failed. See, encountering the richness of the Christian tradition is like standing in a stream or pulling water from a well with a never-ending supply. Maybe this owes itself to the fact that Jesus asked quite a bit of questions and taught often in parables, both of which serve to tap into the imaginations and the lived reality of the people around him. What I think we'll find, hopefully, in other words, is that we are encountering the tips of icebergs. Questions will inevitably come up. Wonderings will float to the surface. And I encourage both of these. Each session is intended to introduce a topic or theme or a question by way of a particular figure or figures. Today, I want to think with you about the interpretation of Scripture. This, of course, is a huge topic, but I think it's critical to think about when we think about our shared faith. It could be argued, and pretty easily, I think, that the history of the church is roughly how the Scriptures have been interpreted and applied in different times and contexts. The Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel said that there are some texts, some books that are living, and some that are dead. The dead ones are like stones, and if you plant a stone in soil, nothing will grow. But the living ones are like seeds, and if you put those in the ground and water them, and with the right conditions, they will grow and give life. The best parts of the Christian tradition have held the Bible out to be a living text. In all its challenge and variety and complexity, the Bible is something worth reading and rereading, or hearing and rehearing. The Bible is a volume that people hold to be full of vitality and possibility, something that demands our attention. And whether we verbalize it or not, Episcopalians believe this deeply. The bulk of our liturgy, week in and week out, comes straight from the Scriptures. From "The Lord be with you," to the blessing, the God of peace who brought again from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep through the blood of the everlasting covenant. Some 70% of our Book of Common Prayer comes directly from the scriptures. So the question is not necessarily if the Bible figures prominently, because it does. The question is rather how we go about interpreting and applying the scriptures. There are 1,000 different ways into this topic, and all of the topics we'll be touching on throughout the series for that matter. But today and throughout these next weeks, we'll look at these topics through the lens of the saints. We'll look at these topics with those who are revered and respected for their lives of faith. So today, when we think together about the interpretation of Scripture, we're going to hone in on St. Gregory of Nyssa, a 4th century bishop in what is today Turkey. In the Episcopal Church, we celebrate Gregory in the sanctoral calendar, the calendar of the saints, on March 9th. Gregory was one of 10 children, 3 of which have been canonized or deemed to be saints by the Church, the other 2 being his older brother Basil of Caesarea and his sister Macrina. While Gregory was a lector in the Church, he did not see himself as destined to ordained leadership. He was instead training to be a rhetorician, and you can find evidence of this throughout his writings. It was his brother Basil who convinced the emperor of the time, Emperor Valens, to appoint Gregory the bishop of Nyssa. Now, Gregory saw himself as wholly unfit for the post and even lamented his ordination as the most miserable day of his life. Gregory struggled through those first few years as bishop. They were capped off by the sudden death of Basil, his brother, and Macrina, his sister. In many ways, however, their deaths freed him to develop his own voice and insight as a bishop and as a theologian. He became transfixed by the inner workings of a life of faith, meditating on the intricacies of the soul, the passion of Christ, and human beings' mystical experiences of God. Gregory lived and ministered in what is often thought of as the golden age of church history, the 4th century. The 4th century saw the church's growth and spread as it was annexed to the Roman Empire. It was a time populated by councils which gave us what we now know as the Nicene Creed. The 4th century is also a time saturated by controversy and therefore, as you could probably imagine, rich in literary output and Christian reflection. For those in the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, east of what we now know of as Serbia, incorporating Albania and Greece, Turkey, and those countries bordering the east coast of the Mediterranean, for the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, Gregory's voice and work was critical to the life and future of the faithful. Of his many available sermons and treatises, I want to highlight Gregory's work called On the Life of Moses, which is dated to the early 390s as we think together about the saints and scripture. This is a work that drips with intellectual rigor and personal piety, that wrestles with the scriptures and wonders how they can offer a unique way of moving forward in the world. As you can imagine from the title, Moses' life is the subject of Gregory's 2-book work. I want to highlight 2 things with you this morning as we think together about the interpretation of Scripture. The first is the seriousness with which Gregory treats the narrative of Moses, the importance of Moses' life as learned, or as he learns it in the Scriptures. The second thing is the spiritual understanding which corresponds to the history or builds out from the history, the spiritual purchase of Moses' life for Gregory. So the seriousness with which Gregory treats the narrative of Moses and the scriptural understanding of Moses' life. It just so happens that the narrative of Moses' life and the spiritual or mystical understanding of it make up the two books of this two-book work, the life of Moses. The first book shows Gregory tracking through Moses' life, enumerating those events that we know well. His being put in a basket as a baby, Pharaoh's daughter caring for him, the revelation at the burning bush, the plagues, the leading of the Israelites through the wilderness, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and even his death. Those things, Gregory writes at the end of Book 1, those things which we have learned from the literal history of the man, that is Moses, we have retraced in summary for you. Now we must adapt the life which we have called to mind to the aim we have proposed for our study, so that we might gain some benefit for the virtuous life from the things mentioned. As you can see indicated here, Gregory moves from the literal narrative of Moses, as it's laid out in the book of Exodus, to something different, something more mystical in Book 2. Book 2 takes us from the detailed recounting of Moses' life to a spiritual program for virtue. In fact, this is what occupies the bulk of Gregory's work. The second book is roughly 3 times longer than the first. Gregory calls the Israelites travelers in virtue, and his interpretation leans into that understanding. All the challenges that Israel encounters in the wilderness then are seen by Gregory as challenges to the pursuit of virtue. They function as symbols for the moral life. There are loads of examples of this throughout Book 2, but one worth mentioning is the crossing of the Red Sea. In the narrative of the crossing of the Red Sea, Gregory maintains that Pharaoh's army, that is, the horses, the chariots, the drivers, are equated to undisciplined passions like pleasure and sorrow and covetousness. And, quote, since passions naturally pursue our nature, Gregory writes, we must put to death in the water both the base movements of the mind and the acts which issue from them. So here we begin to see more of what he's up to. Gregory's concerned with virtue, with the moral formation of readers and hearers. And that, in fact, is what is dictating his reading, his interpretation of the text. This pursuit through the wilderness, literal and figurative, leads up to what Gregory calls the mountain of divine knowledge, to higher levels of virtue, he writes, which are correlated to Moses' trek up Sinai to receive the law from God. In Moses' journey from the worldly challenges of the Egyptians through the wilderness, up the divine mountain, into the cloud of divine luminous darkness, and down again to the world, Gregory sees a picture of this spiritual life. In the end, he concludes that this journey points him to how he understands the vision of God, which he understands as, quote, never being satisfied in the desire to see God. One must always, by looking at what is seen, rekindle the desire to see more. There is no limit to the good, and there is, therefore, for Gregory, no limit to God. The life of Moses, Gregory concludes, is the story of the perfection of a servant's life. Moses is one who has ascended above earthly concern and passion. He shows us, Gregory writes, that humanity's purpose is to be called servants of God by virtue of the lives we live. Quote, since the goal of the virtuous way of life was the very thing we have been seeking, and this goal has been found in what we have said, it is time to look to that example, and by transferring to your own life what is contemplated through the spiritual interpretation of things spoken literally, to be known by God and to become God's friend. This is true perfection, not to avoid a wicked life because, like slaves, we servilely fear punishment, nor to do good because we hope for rewards as if cashing in on the virtuous life by some business-like and contractual arrangement we consider becoming God's friend the only thing worthy of honor and desire. This, as I have said, is the perfection of life. So while virtues, those moral excellences, are good in and of themselves, Gregory sees them as beneficial to us because they make us better friends with God. Now, what we have laid out here is an example of a spiritual sense of the scripture, a style that thrived in the early church. The thinking was that literal history, the literal words which we read on the page that recount historical lives and narratives, can only get us so far when we read the Bible. There was something more, always more, to be understood and appreciated from the text. For Gregory, the scriptures opened themselves up to a remarkable world of ideas and possibilities. So, more than just a near unbelievable narrative of a man leading a group out of bondage and into freedom, the story of Moses and the Israelites speaks to the challenges we encounter. Specifically, for Gregory, the challenges of becoming virtuous as a person of faith, as living well this side of heaven. Now, my purpose in this time is not to make you a convert to the writings of Gregory, though I do think there is much to commend here. My purpose is to give an example of the richness of the spiritual imagination from one named saint, to remind us not just that the scriptures are generative and living, but one way in which they have been interpreted as generative and living. This is just one tiny sliver of a glimpse of what those who have gone before can teach us, I think. They can teach us the content of scriptural interpretation, sure, but they can also teach us a method, a way of seeing the scriptures. For Gregory, there is purpose and intent in the text before him. And that purpose and intent goes beyond and between the words and lines on a page. These scriptures speak to the challenge and possibility and hope of a world often unseen, even while these same texts bear the clear marks of a world that is ever before us. This, I think, shows us how the Bible is indeed a living library of texts that demand reading and rereading and can speak to us in unique ways at different points in our lives. It's this practice of reading and rereading, of hearing and rehearing, of listening, that is uniquely life-giving when done in community, both with those present and with those departed. We have been entrusted as people of faith, entrusted as stewards of these seeds to plant, to tend, and to harvest, trusting that the Spirit is equipping us along the way. So my hope is that with Gregory as our example, we might come to see the saints as teachers in our husbandry, showing us different methods of tending and planting and harvesting in due season. So I'll stop the presentation there and open it up for a time for questions and discussion.